To my mind, the so-called end of Guild Wars 1 was in September of 2012, actually 1 month after the sequel game released, in which we had a substantive Elementalist update, complete with a post on the original website and developer commentary. What a wonderful snapshot in time, where both games had active and interesting things going on. After this, there are no posts any longer. Sure, we've had some amazing updates, like the graphics improvements in 2018 and the anniversary patches, but in general, Guild Wars 1 has been in a deep sleep since then. It's rather eerie reading back at the developers talking about future profession reworks that didn't happen, and live updates to the Alona region that also never happened. At some point, the live team quietly decided to move over to the sequel without a formal goodbye, and the rest is history. I think it's obvious why they did this. Right around Guild Wars 2's launch, it probably seemed like the sequel was just going to be the bigger and better game in every way, and the original was firmly in the shadow of this advanced product. Why should we care much about the Elementalist update? The new Elementalist in Guild Wars 2 is here now. I myself neglected to give this patch its proper attention. And why wouldn't you be excited about the sequel as a reasonable Guild Wars 1 fan? This was still the same studio making it after all. Guild Wars 2 was still built on the same core philosophies and principles as the first was. Hardcore instanced endgame for guilds, respecting players' time, an emphasis on skill, grinding not being necessary for the core experience, but you can grind for cosmetics, no gear treadmill, and a horizontal progression once you hit level cap, and so on. Guild Wars 2 seems set to be the anti-World of Warcraft online game, just as much as its predecessor was, even if now it was more firmly a part of the MMO genre. And the same guys who designed the skills and strategy and combat balance for Guild Wars 1 did it for Guild Wars 2. But the sequel ended up crazy different from Guild Wars 1. MMOs are unwieldy, and by the time the thing released, many statements and ambitions the studio had been previously espousing never landed at all where expected, like endgame difficulty. And there were so many new features and systems to wrestle with, like crafting, jumping, the personality system, and so much other new territory for the franchise. This wasn't simply a more advanced Guild Wars game, but an entirely different beast altogether, albeit with the same lore. Sure, we in the community rationalized, still dazzled by the updated engine. It's just growing pains. Give it a few updates, and where Guild Wars 2 isn't quite hitting the Guild Wars 1 feel, things will improve. But if release Guild Wars 2's persistent world and waypoints and 80 levels was only a few steps away from Guild Wars 1, then by the time of Living World Season 1, and Scarlet Briar, and Fractals, and Infusions, we were miles away. With Heart of Thorns and the elite specialization balance, and Path of Fire and mounts, we drifted light years. I'm not sure, at any point, during all of that, the developers considered much that the directions they were taking Guild Wars 2, great as they may have been, were carving Guild Wars 1 apart as its own distinct product. A product with its own strengths and its own fan base. I think it was just an accident, really. And the truth of just how disparate these products were took many months, even years, to really sink in. So, when ArenaNet initially decided to quietly close the book on Guild Wars 1 updates, it was no surprise. No one really fought it at the time. It's just not economical to release patches for an online world that nearly the entire community has been encouraged to shift away from. ArenaNet more or less confirmed it was their ambition to move wholly onto something new, with the original 2007 PC Gamer magazine article. They've never wavered on that, and I'd like to think we, well-minded Guild Wars 1 players, wrestled with that decision and made our peace with it 12 years ago already. But sentiment toward Guild Wars 1 seems to have been something of a horseshoe, and in more recent years, I'm not surprised at all to see people online desperate for updates. I'm not surprised when I still see hyperbolic Guild Wars 1 fans, who also happen to be arseholes, who openly seethe and spit at the studio for their decision to move on. I'm not surprised that even after 144 months since that PC Gamer article, some people just won't let go, and do things like crowdfund a massive delivery of muffins to the team for making small changes. I'm not surprised at the minor new patch this month, adding 10 new skills to a system that already has over 1,000, caused so many people to return to the game that the studio had to expand server capacity for it. I'm still not arguing that it would be economical to go back. No one out of the studio can make that argument, and it's the most important one. We just don't have the information to make that guess. But I am saying that ArenaNet probably didn't anticipate all this after that Elementalist update in 2012 that ended things. That all the way in the future year of 2020, there would be a large community still enthusiastic about the game, and the studio in general hasn't even been catering to them. I mean, they kept the servers live, that much is true. How could ArenaNet know that in the most recent decade of gaming, neither Guild Wars 2 nor any studio in the whole industry has managed to make a decent new version of this style of strategy RPG? As a result, people haven't moved on. How could they know, after the poor sales of the Nightfall campaign, and still being the obscure underdog to the much larger traditional MMOs like World of Warcraft, which released at about the same time but was now raking it in, that no, they really were onto something brilliant? How could they know that Western markets would happily keep playing games like WoW and RuneScape and other products from the early 2000s for a whopping 20 years and beyond, some of them still hitting in the region of 75% of their highest concurrent user records? So, what I want to do is look at the initial decision to move on. Was it really the right one? In recent years, I've often made the argument that Guild Wars 1 should have continued receiving updates, because it would mean the studio had experience in handling multiple games at once, and so that when they announced a third product in, say, 2017, 18, 19, or whenever, they would have built good faith that the existence of something new wasn't going to mean the abandonment of the old, and the incumbent fan base would be accepting of the new thing, even if it was on mobile or whatever. But I'm not focusing on that argument today, because when it comes to keeping Guild Wars 1 going, there's actually a lot more happening here that has my attention. Because the move to Guild Wars 2 is kind of a fascinating move, and you never really hear people talking about the logistics of what ArenaNet was facing with the actual game at the time of Guild Wars 1 Utopia's cancellation. I opened this video by saying that I think of the end of Guild Wars 1 as that Ellie update in September 2012. But really, the killing blow had come years earlier, when, faced with the production of another new campaign after Nightfall, ArenaNet redefined their business model and never made another one. We've been told many times over the years that there was a meeting in which several studio bigwigs realised that there were a lot of things they wanted to do in Utopia but couldn't do easily, like global branching campaign missions based on player choices and successes or failures, and that making a whole new game from a fresh place would let them do that stuff. That system, by the way, kind of became dynamic events. Stuff like proper jumping, or even mounts if they wanted to, and so they ran with it. Guild Wars 2 was born. And many times in the years since that meeting, the developers have gone on the record expressing serious faults with the original game that they wanted to get out from under. Obviously, not every place where Guild Wars 2 deviated from the original was an accident. What the contemporary Guild Wars 1 boosters never engage with any longer is the fact that Guild Wars 1 was quickly becoming a mess. I'm not talking about unwieldy or archaic code or anything on the technical side. I'm talking about the game's actual design and systems. And I propose that maybe it's because of this that we haven't seen any major Guild Wars 1 updates in the recent half-decade, even after it's become obvious there is a distinct market here ArenaNet could be tapping into. Let's imagine then that we're in an alternate universe now, one where the studio had that meeting, but when they left the room, they had said no. Utopia is what we're doing, and many more campaigns following that. A timeline where Guild Wars 2 never existed at all. What did they have to overcome? Well, a lot. You can already see that they were making compromises by the time of Nightfall, such as the fact that there was no full CGI trailer to market it, unlike with Factions and Prophecies, and, as it happens, I think there would have been many more hard decisions coming. First, let's talk about release pace and crunch. To support their subscription fee-free and microtransaction-free business model, ArenaNet had to work at breakneck speed when releasing new products that they could actually sell. I talked a little about this in my World of Warcraft vs Guild Wars 1 review, but it's actually incredible. While subscription-supported studios like Blizzard were kicking it back and taking it easy, barely releasing a thing, ArenaNet were going at an incredible speed. It was just 1 year after Prophecy's release that Factions came out, and then within 6 months they had Nightfall out too. 6 months! I can only imagine to what degree those people were crunched and the stress from an environment like that. Only for Nightfall to not sell very well, which I've actually come to believe had nothing to do with the quality of their work. Nightfall was great, but more that they had saturated the market, and as well maybe failings of Guild Wars factions earlier in the year, having made certain fans disinterested. What's particularly devastating to me, seeing how great Nightfall was, is the fact you can clearly see how good ArenaNet were getting at their work and implementing this style of game before throwing it all in the bin. Nightfall was just so crisply and coherently made, and I'm not just talking about the lore and world building, which had reached an all-time high. It's like how in Alona elite armors slowly increased in price and were intelligently filtered over the course of the campaign, or how the tutorial island was just the right size, bigger than Xingji but smaller than Pre-Searing, though with more quest and length than either, how the campaign branched at certain junctions, how they didn't just add heroes but also special hidden new outfits to collect for them, or how brutal and well-made the Domain of Anguish endgame stuff was on release. I think of them during this era like Squaresoft was in the early 90s, cranking out these Final Fantasy RPGs in rapid succession, but getting really fucking good, and suddenly, by number 6, they have a masterpiece on their hands. I wonder what ArenaNet's Campaign 6 would have been. But they couldn't sustain it. I think the way forward with Utopia and beyond would have been to crank the release pace down to 1 a year, or even 1 a year and a half. And I still believe in campaigns, not expansions. The notion of a shared online world, but with different entry points, and you don't have to own them all, is genuinely a brilliant thing. I look at it a bit like how the Pokemon games release new editions that are simply adding to this greater whole, but to a more integrated level, as we're actually on the same unifying platform. Guild Wars Factions is a lot like Pokemon Gold if you think about it, where you can beat it and then return to the previous region with your new skills, which are kind of like the Pokemon themselves in this example. And you can't argue with the success of that franchise one bit, but I digress. If one of the problems with Guild Wars 1 was that they had to work that fast because otherwise the money wouldn't be coming in, I do unfortunately think that microtransactions come to the rescue, and in fact, I think it's inevitable we would have seen them in the game eventually, especially with the general direction of the industry. I think if I were ArenaNet, I would have used microtransactions to keep us going during the longer gaps between full campaign releases so that we don't oversaturate the market and my devs aren't so crunched all the time. Overall, I think the healthiest way to go would have been to take updates like the Sorrow's Furnace release and actually sell them to the player base instead of dropping them in for free. Buying content rather than skins feels much more appropriate to me in a game like Guild Wars, where if you sell skins, you basically contaminate the whole grind for prestige cosmetics principle that is propping up the entire game's ecosystem. That concept is an important one, and is thoroughly undermined by the practice of selling skins for real-world cash, a problem you can clearly see with the sequel, Guild Wars 2. And if you're doubtful, just remember that this is a concept we saw ArenaNet of the day actually utilize, with the bonus mission pack. I think there are complications with regard to fragmenting the player base, which is why the bonus mission pack was sold as single player content, but these are probably overblown issues, when the fundamental campaign model is inherently fragmenting people over time, based on which campaign they do or do not own. Why not have that with mini DLCs also? Yes, we saw a variety of other microtransactions added to Guild Wars 1 over the Eye of the North years, like outfits and stuff, or like mercenaries, and those really crossed the line in terms of selling power to the players. But I view these as Hail Mary updates that only really exist because ArenaNet knew they were closing curtains, and it didn't matter much anymore. They needed money in the long way to develop Guild Wars 2. If they were sticking with the first game long term, I don't think much of these kinds of microtransactions would ever have happened. This talk of microtransactions that actually offer content and always working towards the next big thing to sell is exactly how Paradox Studios has successfully operated over the back half of the 2010s, right now into the 2020s. And it leads me nicely to my next point, that Guild Wars Utopia needed to come with a lot of housekeeping. What Paradox does, and what ArenaNet could have done, or was doing, is clearly successful, but as any Paradox fan will tell you, it does come with a downside. This model doesn't leave time for proper bug fixing and cleanup. The developers by necessity push something out, give it a quick once over, and hit the really significant issues, then move on, layering new systems that they can sell to you very soon later that will wonkily sit on top of the previous still wonky systems, and the game steadily becomes messy. The business is successful anyway, since casuals don't really care about the wonkiness, they just see the new shinies and interesting ideas in the trailer, get excited and buy, and the casuals are the majority. But it does tick off the hardcore users over time, who really appreciate the more nuanced mechanics and less visible mistakes that are nonetheless becoming big inhibitors to their enjoyment. Guild Wars 1 Nightfall was already in the same position, and I would argue that if ArenaNet really wanted to keep going, they had a lot of cobwebs to dust off and systems to make uniform as they were releasing Utopia. Damage types are a great microcosm demonstrating this. Like, what's the difference between chaos and dark damage if the distinction is never used? It's just there for flavor? I know they're mechanically different, but do we really need dark and shadow damage? Why are the rules about what is armor ignoring damage and what is not so obscure? Like how Holy ignores armor unless it's on an attack. Why do so many skills just randomly do typeless damage? Did they simply forget to add a typing sometimes? Like with all those necromancer skills that should probably be cold damage? Why do blunt, piercing and slashing damage still exist if they're hardly utilizing them in Nightfall? Some stuff is more prominent, like known stalling bugs in missions and quests for prophecies or factions that could absolutely have been cleaned out, but they never had time to do. Or what are they going to do about all the mechanically superior old school weapons floating around, if anything? Are inscriptions going to be added to prophecies and factions at any point? And the unique weapon drops that are kind of everywhere that totally break the general rules of crafting, are those allowed long term, or what? How about the weird skills that hero AI hasn't been properly hooked up to use, so they're essentially useless? How about the matter of ascension? They had originally implemented this idea that at a specific story point you ascend, and then you get access to endgame god realms. When factions released, they duplicated the whole idea and repackaged it with some alternate lore, but never actually expanded on the original endgame god zones beyond the underworld and the fissure of woe. Instead, they opted to add endgame exclusive to the new campaign, Ergo's Warren in the Deep, probably as a means to generate more revenue from Prophecies players who now had to pay and visit Cantha. So then, in the Nightfall campaign, Ascension still existed as a mechanic, but they clearly couldn't be bothered with it any longer, and it just happens almost randomly in the middle of a basically unrelated quest during the main story, that's only vaguely related to the gods. They were still copying locations like the Temple of the Aegis, this time it was the Chantry of Secrets, but again, there was no expansion of God Realm zones. Were they going to go through all this busy work for Utopia too? What about the petty stuff, like visible world holes in the Prophecies campaign, or typos all over the place? I have a feeling that had we gone to Utopia and beyond, this kind of stuff would have kept building up and gone unresolved until eventually Guild Wars 1 was full of bizarre and inscrutable details that weighed it down. To be fair, I think that staging the new campaign content in entirely new territories and having a fresh start point kind of creates a natural resistance to these problems, a luxury the Paradox model doesn't benefit from. It's one of the things I think so genius about ArenaNet's campaign approach, but a lot of this stuff actually crosses boundaries, and by the time of Utopia, the game really needed to make decisions on things, needed to unify systems and stick with them. That would have slowed Utopia's release down. Now let's talk about some other of the logistical challenges that aren't just housekeeping, but really would have become a big problem over time, starting with something simple but fun. Cross-Continental Travel. So far in Guild Wars 1, whenever they had added a new campaign and region to the world, they also added new quests to the previously existing areas of the world to allow old players to travel to the new places and integrate the old players into the new stories. For the first release, Factions, this was simple. They added one quest to Lion's Arch, teaching players about the plague and allowing them to go on a boat to Cantha. Then a follow-up quest to get them to the actual first mission, which was an interesting split mission with a 16-man party size. And then you were in the story. And meanwhile, they added a reverse quest in Kaineng Center, allowing players to take a boat back to Lion's Arch, but with additional information explaining that these old events took place in the past. But then, with Nightfall, they had to add many more. quests from Lion's Arch to Kamadan, Kamadan to Lion's Arch, Kamadan to Kaineng, Kaineng to Kamadan, as well as follow-up quests for foreign players to integrate into the storylines of wherever they were going. For what it's worth, for Eye of the North, they also had to do an annoying job introducing 3 starting points to the expansion and being vague and hand-wavy about the lore while they were at it. Now imagine Utopia had happened. Utopia would have wanted so many combinations it would have been laughable, with most of the player base not appreciating or caring about any of the work. This tedious nonsense would have gotten utterly out of control by a 5th campaign. Now, we can't know how ArenaNet would have chosen to solve this, but I feel like what I would have done is ultimately use the Battle Isles. The Battle Isles are the only cross-campaign hub location in the game where players from all continents can interact with one another, even if they own completely different products. It's actually kind of cool imagining a world where Guild Wars 1 had been going for many years, and players from products several years away from each other could still interact at the Great Temple. A bit like how Embark Beach was added to this region, and the Zaisha Menagerie, even though they had nothing to do with PvP, I think a utopian ArenaNet would have done the same thing. I'd have the quests for foreigners to enter new campaigns start here, and just have a single quest or quest chain that everyone does together. Problem solved. Hell, these days, Embark Beach is practically begging to be that spot, though obviously it never existed at the time. Let's talk about some more fundamental issues, because Guild Wars 1 was full of them, and a part of moving to Guild Wars 2, and just having Eye of the North, is that it enabled the studio to duck ever having to answer questions like these. Like heroes. Heroes themselves were a contentious system in that they afforded player freedom at the cost of meaningful cooperative experiences, and many people didn't like them, and didn't like how dead and empty Nightfall felt when playing with so few pugs around compared to prophecies and factions. In a way, the question of, were heroes good for the game, is sort of the start of an epic thing with this franchise as it went through the Guild Wars 2 years. The question of, to what degree convenience can be a bad thing or undermine decent game system, and it's something the team has been wrestling with furiously ever since. At some point, I think the utopian ArenaNet would have had to have made a call on this. In the real world, as the community shrank in Guild Wars 1's twilight years, they expanded the number of controllable heroes from 3 to 7, giving you complete control without having to interact with anyone else. But Nightfall's actual design had it at just 3, meaning there was still some worth in playing with at least one other person. Maybe Utopia would have lowered the number to just 2, or even 1 in response to the feedback. Having one player and a single AI companion was one of the super early ideas they had for Guild Wars 2 after all, as explained in the PC Gamer article. Maybe they would have nerfed the heroes to be much weaker than players, but still give you a lot of control, which is already kind of true because of their shoddy AI and not having access to PvE skills, so there's still some encouragement to play with others. But there was another issue brewing. Nightfall didn't just introduce heroes, but it introduced heroes for every single profession in the game. And bonus heroes for players who owned multiple campaigns. This was obviously done to make the campaign as big and as value for money as possible, but I think it was probably really short-sighted. If they had continued with that precedent in Utopia, not only would the whole bonus hero thing have gotten unwieldy in all the ways the quest did that I mentioned before, but we'd be bursting with heroes to scroll through on the UI already. By the time of Campaign 5, the implementation of all that would be unbearable. And you can get a sense of this in-game right now. If you have a character that unlocked all the main heroes, including the optional Winds of Change and Hearts of the North ones, and 7 mercenary heroes, you're in for a lot of scrolling, and a lot of choice. Sure, you can argue they just need to redo the hero recruitment user interface, add filters and whatnot, but that doesn't escape another issue, that the players who are buying all the campaigns are becoming much more powerful than anyone else due to the freedom they're receiving, having 5 mesmers at their fingertips instead of just 1 or 2 like everyone else. And that's wrong in all the same ways that mercenaries were. We obviously saw with Eye of the North, with the studio knowing this problem would never be given time to flourish, that they added another full set of heroes. But I think if I were forced to think long term about this, Utopia couldn't have had many heroes. Ideally, Nightfall wouldn't have even included the full set of professions. That way, there'd be exciting gaps to be filled by upcoming products. Maybe the new heroes would just represent the new classes of the campaign, and that's it. But the problem is that because Nightfall had added a full roster, you're basically telegraphing to the community that Nightfall is the de facto most important campaign to buy because it is the one that gives you the most heroes. And that's definitely not right. And no, I don't think the whole bonus hero in old campaigns like Elias thing was sustainable. We didn't even see ArenaNet pull that one again in Eye of the North. Probably the most elegant solution I would go with is to reduce the number of heroes a player can add to just 2 or even 1. That solves a lot of what we talked about, as long as the community could buy into it, and another issue gets resolved too. The massively steepened learning curve ArenaNet introduced to new players, who are now not only being asked to learn their own class skills, runes, insignias, their secondary profession, but also the main and secondary profession of all the skills of all the AI characters too. The beautiful simplicity of just adding Alessia, healer henchman, was starting to slip. The fewer heroes, the better. Speaking of skills, that's another area in need of attention. The way that ArenaNet operated up through Nightfall was this. They had a concept of core skills that would appear in all campaigns. This was a reasonably sized set of skills that you could always get no matter what campaign you were in. They were repeat customers and typified what the class they were attached to was all about, like the Elementalist's Fireball ability. Then, there were sets of skills attached to specific campaigns which were more nuanced, and in the best examples were thematically tied to the region of the world too. Like how a core Elementalist AoE skill was Meteor Shower, but the Nightfall campaign, set in a desert region, let you learn the skill Savannah Heat. Veteran and established fans loved the new sets of skills because obviously they already owned the core set, and so when buying a new product, they were really only getting value from that flashy new stuff. And it put massive pressure on ArenaNet to keep spamming new skills out, many of which could be duds. And sometimes, ArenaNet would have to cheat and implement weird and frustrating double skills that just wouldn't work long term. Like for example, in the Prophecies campaign, Elementalists could get the skill Earthquake, which provided a specific worthwhile effect, but wasn't core. So when factions came around and they wanted that effect too, they just copy-pasted the same skill and gave it a new name, Dragon Stomp. When factions came out, there were 48 duplicate skills like this, and aside from the wrinkle that players who owned both campaigns could now equip both at once, people in general weren't happy. Utopia obviously couldn't do this, and more respect to Nightfall, they actually managed to avoid it there altogether. But Nightfall had its own problem. The Assassin and the Ritualist. These two professions did not need to be attached to that campaign in any way. They were exclusive to factions. But since the 6 core professions were all expecting to get new abilities in Alona, ArenaNet committed to adding more for the Ritualist and the Assassin too. This meant that despite the fact only a small proportion of the game's population would have been Ritualists and Assassins, and despite the fact that Alona had its own new classes to implement, they went ahead and added a heap of skills on top of everything else, even PvE enemies that utilized those professions, which was a nice touch, even if, again, it was totally screwing with the learning curve and matrix of skills people expected to know about. That's all very fun and value for money as a player. Believe me, I get it. I mained an Assassin at the time, so having Assassin stuff to get in Nightfall was brilliant to me. But in doing this, ArenaNet had opened Pandora's box, because now they had established the precedent that it was okay to expect infinite updates to your profession even long after your campaign was over. Utopia was going to have the job of adding the core profession skills, more Assassin and Ritualist skills, more Paragon and Dervish skills, and its new professions. Campaign 5 is spiraling out of control beyond that. This had to stop, and I'm not even talking about how this massive skill pool would have become an unpredictable and unmanageable monster when in the community's hands. We'll come back to that in a moment. Just the sheer implementation work involved would have been staggering, and the second they reveal that, no, sorry, the Assassin will never get any new skills, a bunch of diehard Assassin mains would have hated on the new campaigns, even if they would have been capable of taking that character into the new region and finding new loot or whatever, because really, Guild Wars 1 was about the skills. I think this issue was so prominent that a fix couldn't have been delayed for Campaign 5. So there was a definite element of Utopia that would not sell well with the player base of the time. After the Nightfall sales, that was probably scary, so the studio ran with the concept of a Guild Wars 2 instead. If I was to try and fix this after Nightfall opened the box already, I think I would probably commit to a +1 type system, whereby previous professions get 1 extra campaign of skill additions, but that's it. So Utopia would have cut off the Assassin and Ritualist, but still continued to add new Paragon and Dervish stuff. Campaign 5 would have cut off the Paragon and Dervish, and Campaign 6 would have cut off the Chronomancer and the Summoner. This way, you still get a little of the cross-pollination, and you encourage new entries to the franchise to buy the previous campaign when they see a weird, unavailable class, but you put a cap on the exponential growth. Another idea I'm particularly keen on is the idea of professions actually coming back. Campaign 6, for example, once again takes place in a deeply spiritual area of the world, and the Ritualist becomes a playable class again with a new set of skills available years after we last saw it in factions. I think that would generate real hype, and would solve another issue involving new professions that we should really get to talking about. Guild Wars 1 was adding way too many professions. They had added 4 playable classes in the space of 1 year, and with Utopia they were set to go to 6. Now yes, I appreciate how new professions were a cornerstone feature that sold these boxes, but I cannot see how, in any way, ArenaNet could have kept going with this. First are the flavor considerations. At this crazy speed, there just aren't that many aesthetics and archetypes to get to before you're sorta rebranding and tweaking what you've already got. I love the Paragon. They gave it more than enough window dressing to make it feel unique and, in the end, its own thing. But let's face it, we already had the idea of a heavy armored dude who shouts across the battlefield with the Tactics Warrior. And yeah, the Whirling Dervish is a beautiful idea to pair with a place like Alona. But what, we're not using Earth magic anymore? We're using Earth prayers? It's not air, it's wind magic now? Honestly, I think the Chronomancer and Summoner were really inspired proposals for Utopia that might have really stood out. But how long before things are looking tired? At 2 professions a campaign? Maybe sooner than you'd expect. More important than this, new professions were doing something to Guild Wars 1 that was really unfortunate, undermining the multiple profession system. When Prophecies released, people would look at the Warrior and look at the Necromancer and say, hey wow, I can combine these two and create a Death Knight character who sucks the life of those around me to keep myself alive. And they would have fun making builds work out of it. By the end of Nightfall though, the game had broken down into something altogether different, waiting for ArenaNet to pre-package an idea for you and then sell it to you as a profession in the new campaign. People weren't building Death Knights, they were waiting for one. And that de-emphasized a lot of the most important aspects of the class system. And let's talk about mechanics. There's a very real reason why Guild Wars 2 was built to conform to the simple boons and conditions system. It's because Guild Wars 1, with all its unique and specific effects, was getting out of control. With each new set of skills, and particularly each new profession, came a slew of new interactions and effects to mouse over and get to grips with. It's not just enchantments now. You should know about chants, and anthems, and echoes, and flash enchantments, and teardowns, and avatars. And that's just with Nightfall. It's not just the original weapons, but you should know about daggers and scythes and spears and urns. Juggling all of this wasn't easy, and a lot of stuff fell through the cracks, like how on release, the Paragon was ridiculously overpowered in PvE, nerfed to dirt weeks later, and then by the time I and many other people got around to playing it, it felt kind of awful and underwhelming for a lot of the time. Now listen, I'm not against new professions, really, I just think ArenaNet were going too fast. I think the Utopian ArenaNet would have been best implementing only 1 new profession of every campaign, instead of 2. They still have all the core professions and their twists on them to captivate people, but in this way they've eased the gas and been able to make something really fun. And they'd have new concepts to mess with that were really valuable for years before anything felt dry. Further, I would stick to my guns about what I said earlier. Bring old classes back. Each new campaign could have introduced 2 professions, one that was totally new, and also re-implemented something old that hadn't been touched for a while, with new skills obviously. I mean, come on, there would definitely come a day where something broad as an assassin would fit in the aesthetic of a new continent. It shouldn't be stuck only in Cantha forever, so let's bring the assassin back and give it a new set of toys for this campaign. PvP formats were another place that the team really needed to ease the gas. One of the biggest issues with Guild Wars 1 up until Nightfall was the number of competitive formats they had on their hands, and the developers made no attempts to hide from the fact that they hated this. There is a reason that Guild Wars 2 launched with only a single mode for competitive PvP, and they stuck to it so hard for so many years. It's because in Guild Wars 1, where they had random arenas, and team arenas, and Heroes Ascent, and Jade Quarry, and Fort Aspenwood, and Alliance battles, and Hero battles, and, yes, Guild versus Guild, they couldn't begin to balance it all. And the player population had become so fractured and fragmented across all the formats that matchmaking would suffer, or population would die out completely. People don't seem to remember this, but until ArenaNet pushed out a big rewards scheme in the later years, both JQ and FA were more or less dead for a long time during what we would consider the game's heyday to be. There were so many formats that even when the team eventually implemented PvP skill balance separate from PvE, they still couldn't hope to juggle what was a meaningful skill in a guild versus guild environment compared to, say, a random arenas environment where the party size was lower and totally different skills would shine over others. Credit again to Nightfall, which only added hero battles, but after factions, I think the team realised they were beyond the point of no return on this one, and could never make intelligent balance moves in one place without pissing off diehards in another. And shutting down formats wasn't much of an option. People resent seeing things be taken out of the games they love, even more than they hate seeing them have no population and be effectively removed anyway. Even to this day, you can incense diehard hero battle fans who just won't let go of the fact that their precious arena was closed down. A utopian ArenaNet would have needed an extremely stern hand when it came to these formats and communicating whether they still cared about them or not. 3 or 4 more campaigns down the road, would it really have mattered that the Jade Quarry was unpopulated? My solution would have been this: no more new formats, ever. Focus on adding new maps that expanded the existing formats, but go no more than that. New places to battle in random arenas or team arenas, new guild halls should continue, each becoming a new battleground to fight on for the most prestigious format, and even new hero battles locations can happen too, but it has to stop there. For any peripheral formats that are seriously dying, I would generally let them and use reward weekends or things like the later Zaician bounties to artificially bring a population back every now and then, but stop stressing about trying to balance those places and be frank with the community about where your true ambitions are. I think that items and loot are really interesting to look at if Guild Wars 1 was going to go on for many more campaigns. One of the fundamental principles of the whole franchise was to not implement a gear treadmill, whereby stronger armor and weapons would come along and later replace existing stuff. That worked very well in the early years, and the game was more about acquiring cool looking skins more than acquiring powerful ones. They'd also introduced the concept of green weapons in late prophecies, which were now absolutely everywhere in Nightfall and factions, allowing a lot of players to hit the gear cap quite comfortably. I think by the time Utopia was due, so many greens existed and enough time had passed that for many core players, the shiny race was starting. It's a problem that Guild Wars 2 ran into also, and in that game's case it was sped up by the existence of the gem store. Once people have some cool skins that they like the look of, the game has to make something even cooler looking to convince you to give up the old thing and go for the new. That's why Nightfall had things like the Elemental Sword and the Tormented weapons, which were all much more flashy than things that had come before them, and it ticked many players off. It's why in Eye of the North they went even further, making prestige weapons larger and generally shinier, with the Chaos Gloves being an extreme example. Guild Wars 1 generally has a reputation as a game with a realistic, refined aesthetic that didn't do all the other insane kiddie light show stuff that all the other MMOs do. But I don't think they really solved the issue at all. The Chaos Gloves were really crazy. They might have been implemented that way because, like with so many elements of Eye of the North, the devs expected to move on and just wanted to get you as much playtime as possible. But I have a feeling that Utopia wouldn't have been far behind. Those Nightfall examples are totally fair game, and 100% tampered with the game's original aesthetic. In many ways, I think Guild Wars 1 is a bit like Firefly, or any great TV show that was cancelled in its prime. You hate that it ended, but you also never had to endure watching its inevitable fall apart. It's preserved while it was good, and that's kinda nice. Guild Wars 1 getting microtransactions is probably the same story. It would have happened, and the game would have deteriorated. I'm not sure how I would resolve this problem at all. The Utopian ArenaNet could have experimented with adding different types of runes and weapon mods, sure. Treat the gear like they treated the skill system, just adding new choices meant to be on the same power level. But how long before they misstep, and something is too good, and we're suddenly looking at a gear treadmill by the back door? For more food for thought, you can look at Guild Wars 2, which has had many more years of active development, and has been tasked with fighting the exact same battle. My next talking point is enormous, and it ties together several issues we already touched briefly on, that I'm sure intimidated the hell out of the studio back in 2007. The first thing to know is that Guild Wars 1's PvE was built with an extremely fun, but scary system at its heart. The monsters weren't just boring cutouts that stand around in fields auto-attacking you, like in most MMOs, including Guild Wars 2. These monsters all used player skills and player balance. It's beautiful, really. All the AI work that went into the AI henchmen companions and later heroes could simply be applied to all the enemies in the game, and suddenly you have a really rich and diverse system on your hands. Foes can be quickly added, but every type can have its own skill bar that makes it a distinct experience to fight from the enemies that came before or will go after it. The experience is always changing for the player, and while they're at it, they're learning at a good steady rate about all the abilities that belong to other professions, knowledge they can take with them into the PvP formats later if they wish to. There wasn't often an experience of a trash mob in Guild Wars 1, not really, and you didn't have to wait for a boss to come along with heaps of custom-made code and bespoke work to finally be entertained and experience something different. Sure, Guild Wars 1 did that stuff too, but it didn't have to. They just had to invent fun monster bars and filter them around the world. Like how different it feels to fight a pack of Mandragora compared to a Jade Brotherhood gang or some roaming Hydra. And bosses who could use regular skills but with insane strength were distinct too. Guild Wars 1 players can instantly identify these experiences as different. But the system had a downside: its effect on skill balance. Because yes, if the studio wanted to buff a skill, they had to be very careful to see how it would affect all of the monsters that use that same thing, or else they'd break the game. Right up till as late as the big Elementalist rework at the end of the game's life, you can read developer commentary about how they would like to buff a certain skill in a certain way, but they couldn't, because it would mean that certain areas of PvE got insanely hard. And the problem was doubly as challenging in the early days before they implemented split PvP balance. Yes, and I'm sure you can imagine how insane this is. The game was once in a place where a skill might be buffed because it's too weak in GVG, and suddenly it's affected an endgame PvE farm, and vice versa. The more campaigns, the more formats, the more enemies implemented, especially those using core skills, the more absolutely impossible this would have been to fully test and keep track of. Even rudimentary skill changes would have to be verified over 5, 6, 7 separate areas or missions. And that's not to talk of functionality changes to these skills. If the developers felt that they had to go to that length to improve something, it would mean a whole new set of AI for allies and enemies, later split over normal mode and hard mode, that needed to be checked out in all the areas of the game, quests and missions. And this was all before Utopia. As you probably know, PvP was the big interest of ArenaNet at the time. Originally, they didn't really want to split balance based on game mode, and for a solid reason. You don't want to make the learning curve any worse. If a big idea is that PvE is the training ground for PvP, then it's utterly backwards to have a skill you learned in PvE suddenly be acting differently in the new mode, especially if the user interface doesn't really draw your attention to that fact in a good way. There's also the matter of having even more work for the balance team. ArenaNet resisted for a while, and when it finally happened, they were very careful to have whatever differences be things like recharge, cast time, cost, instead of full-blown functionality changes, and this alleviated their problems. The PvE/PvP split was received extremely well by the community and proved to be a good decision. I think the days following the implementation of the split to Guild Wars 1 are really fascinating, because the studio, preoccupied with how this affected PvP, totally missed the fact that they had invented something that could have saved the whole game and closed Pandora's box. Let's look at some of the other issues. While PvP balance was no longer affecting PvE, certain areas of PvE were still affecting other areas of PvE, like how the developers buffed Fevered Dreams in the later years for Mesmer players to use, and it was fine for Prophecies, but made those aforementioned Mandragora in a loner brutally dangerous. And, as I mentioned, this was happening contained within the PvP side of the game, with Alliance battle balance being inappropriate for team arenas, for example. Then there was balance across the whole game to consider when a new campaign came out, and the consequence of adding so many skills to the existing pool. If you talk to a real, die-hard PvP player from back in the day, a lot of them kind of hated the factions expansion, because the combinations between the hundreds of new skills and the existing ones that the studio could have never possibly hoped to guess at on their own came along and tore down the delicate and well-crafted meta that players had come to love during the Prophecies era. And when Nightfall came out, the same thing happened again, but to a much more severe degree, with several build combinations being not just strong, but insanely broken, like Sand Shards comes to my mind on this one. I think Blizzard's Hearthstone, which came along many years later, is one of the most incredible things to compare to Guild Wars 1. As you probably know, Guild Wars 1's whole skill and class system was based on Magic the Gathering, a physical card game, just as Hearthstone was. And it kind of makes these games cousins. Just as ArenaNet had a chaotic mess on their hands when a new set of skills came out, so too did Hearthstone when it released new cards, so too did Magic the Gathering. And you know how they fixed that? With standardized formats, whereby many of the old cards are removed from the pool in favor of the newer stuff. There could be a core set, just as Guild Wars 1 has a core set of skills, and the rest shuffles. There is no question in my mind that a utopian ArenaNet could have done this. In fact, they probably should have done it with Nightfall already. This way, they could keep the total skill pool down and have a more clear sense of what was going on. And for those that hate the idea, don't worry, there can always be a place for a wild format, in which all skills are legal all the time. It can become a horrible, broken mess, sure, but people know that's what they're getting in for. Non-competitive action with broken synergies. Many of you will have forgotten this by now, but in the later years of PvP, ArenaNet added a concept of flux to try to force artificial metas, shifting player skill choices over the months and keep things at least a little fresh. Flux adds global effects everyone lives under, such as doing more damage to your own profession, and creates mini-metas, but it's essentially just a band-aid thrown on by the team at the last moment. Well, in this scenario, where they went for formats, Flux wouldn't be needed at all. The developers could have implemented special weekends or other periods of time where we're not playing the newest format anymore, but instead we're back to last campaign's balance, or the campaign before that. Or, if they have an especially strong format that the player base has really fallen in love with and is creating amazing tournament experiences, they can stick with that while they work out the kinks in newer ones. And what about PvE? Well, this is exactly how the principles and technology behind the PvP/PvE split would have closed Pandora's box, by drawing fences around campaigns and calling them formats. Don't just split away the battle isles, but once a campaign's had its time in the sun and all its post-release updates and something new's come out, split that into its own format, freezing it in time. Split it away with the express intent of not having to worry about balancing it anymore. I'll give you an example. Imagine that Utopia has released, and much like with Guild Wars 2, the balance team has started speeding everything up. All the cast times on the average are shorter, all the cooldowns are faster, all the energy costs are lower, and so on. And now, Meteor Shower, which enemies in the Utopia campaign use, really should be faster too. So you just buff Meteor Shower because that's the utopian format, but Prophecies wasn't affected. This has the other benefit, something that I deeply value, of meaning that at any point over the following 15 years, a player could return to the Prophecies campaign, make a new character, and continue to have an authentic and fun experience with the skills and the balance on the enemies that wasn't broken by power creep and subsequent updates. Another pressure on Guild Wars 1 that this elegantly resolves is that of learning curve and feature bloat. The team openly expressed that it sucked making the Nightfall tutorial because it was the third tutorial they had made for the game already, and this one had so many more skill types and mechanics to talk to players about, and now they were staring down the barrel of the gun having to do it with Utopia again. Well, if we're separating each campaign into its own thing a little more, then you can totally skip over talking about the ritualist binding rituals in Utopia, because those won't feature in the current PvP format. They're not being used by these PvE enemies, and you can't play that class in this campaign anyway. And that's it. And what's amazing is that the studio had proved it can be done. On a technological level and everything, the whole principle was operating in-game. You go to the battle aisles, and your skills automatically swap to the new format. It could have done that for PvE campaigns. They really didn't have to run to Guild Wars 2 at all for this reason. The only wrinkle in all of this is what happens when, say, a Chronomancer returns to Prophecies. Does he get to use his OP 2009 Chronomancer skills in the 2006 content, even if it's not the format? Or is he just forced to use his secondary profession instead? My final talking point involves one large elephant in the room I still haven't mentioned, and that's the topic of new features. Clearly, as ArenaNet themselves said, they went to Guild Wars 2 because they had ideas they were passionate about that would just be too annoying to try in Guild Wars 1. Like jumping. The game had no Z-axis, so how would they ever do that as more than just an emote? How would they ever compete with other MMOs that did a lot more with the environments vertically, while Guild Wars 1 is stuck on the same plane? Jumping had always been a thorn in the game's side, and it's just one example of several. To this, I have no real answer. If the studio says it wasn't possible without building from the ground up again, I believe it. But I will say that I'm surprised the studio got so tired of the Guild Wars 1 format as fast as they did, to the point that they felt they had to reinvent the wheel with this stuff. I already talked about how much they improved with the Guild Wars Nightfall in terms of campaign quality, and there were still so many dimensions of the experience that were open to be messed with or refined. Like party size. Guild Wars 2 eventually asserted that 8-man party sizes were too much, and 5 was much better. It's easier to get 4 friends together than 7. You can get a much greater sense of your contribution to the team when you're 5-man than when you're 8. I happen to agree with that, but they could totally have done that in Guild Wars 1. Guild Wars 2 lent more into solo experiences, which Guild Wars 1 was also more than capable of, like the bonus mission pack and pre-searing Ascalon demonstrated. Guild Wars 2 wanted to give you a personal home that updated as the story progressed. Well, not only was that possible in Guild Wars 1, but it had somewhat happened already at the command post, and then later again at the Hall of Monuments. You can make arguments for graphics and render capability, but I'm not even convinced that Guild Wars 2 was entirely needed for that either. Eye of the North looks light years ahead of Prophecies despite being the same game. We would have simply kept trending upwards. And after all, Guild Wars 2 is still the same engine as the original anyway. Guild Wars 1 still had so much to give. When we diehards fantasize about returning to the game and having new content to play, we're not interested in returning to Guild Wars 1, but only contingent on the existence of a branching campaign mission system that works like the Alliance Battle Border in Cantha or simulates a dynamic event. We're not holding off because we can't climb trees in Guild Wars 1, which, yes, they said was one of their early ideas for the sequel in PC Gamer. We're holding off just because there isn't more of it. There's nothing to do anymore. And this isn't just nostalgia talking. I think a lot of intelligent people are right to be cynical whether Guild Wars 1 really was that good. And the truth is that people are just blinded by nostalgia and rose-tinted glasses, unironically blathering on about the good old days just like their narrow-minded grandparents before them did. I bet even the studio feels this way about Guild Wars 1 diehards. Well, I'm here to tell you, while a ton of people are completely inobjective about Guild Wars 1 at this point, it's not all nostalgia. With this recent update adding just 10 new skills, I found myself on a real kick with the game, theory crafting new builds and reading about mechanics, taking the content totally on its own terms with a real vigor. That wasn't contingent on any new features, just a couple of skills. So yeah, I do wonder when it came to new features whether ArenaNet really had just become preoccupied with things that weren't that important. Sure, I get their excitement. Being a game developer is being in a creative medium, and artists always want to push the boundaries, ArenaNet perhaps more than most. But did Utopia need that stuff? I don't think so. It could have played it fairly by the book, simply improving on things just as Nightfall had done, and it likely would have been fantastic. Especially if it had happened after a few years when people realised that Guild Wars 2 wasn't giving them their fix and now were desperate for more Guild Wars 1 style experiences. The real question is whether a more refined, less featured version of Utopia could have been solved for profit to the fan base of the day, and I can't answer that one. So let's conclude. I think that anyone who's angry at ArenaNet for moving to Guild Wars 2 needs to seriously consider just how much work needed to happen for Utopia and beyond to be a success. To really make Guild Wars 1 stick as a format on the long term was not as clear-cut and as a solved science as it might have seemed. I deeply regret how shallow most of the talking points on this topic have become in the past 8 years, especially on the part of the Guild Wars 1 fans. I do personally believe that the campaign format for a shared online world makes for a brilliant business model, a lost business model now, and that with a few tweaks could catapult any gaming startup to success, but ArenaNet of the day weren't to know that. Probably the biggest mistake people make when thinking about Guild Wars 1 these days is entirely overestimating just how long-lived the whole thing was. They gave it 2 years, guys. 24 months before Nightfall is out and Utopia is about to be cancelled in favour of Guild Wars 2. While I think, looking back, there clearly were ways through, and I hope this video demonstrated some of them to you, I don't necessarily blame them for their decision back in 2007. The compromises the team would probably have to make for the Utopia campaign and subsequent to work, like longer development time, less profession skills, less emphasis on new features, might have been just too much for consumers to swallow. Better to strike while the iron is hot and tempt them with a sequel game that can promise the horizon and more. What I do think is more sad is in 2012, when the final balance patch released. Had no one at the studio noticed at that point, really, that Guild Wars 2 was nothing like the original, like nothing on the whole market, that old games could still earn money with continued work, and further development might have been worth something? Did no one guess that the community leaving might only be a temporary thing? Perhaps it was a matter of pride, and the higher-ups felt that return to Guild Wars 1 work might be seen as something of a failure, since it would be tacitly an acceptance that Guild Wars 2 didn't do certain things as well as Guild Wars 1. It's actually something I much respect about Jagex and their release of old-school RuneScape, and their success from that I would say is well-deserved. I know what you're probably all now wondering. Couldn't they go back and just make Utopia, or an equivalent, now? If everything we discussed in this video has merit, and there really was a way through, why not? And it is a captivating idea. I think about Borderlands 2 a lot when it comes to this. Gearbox was producing DLC for that game way back in 2013, just a year after our last Guild Wars 1 Elementalist update, and then, like ArenaNet, they stopped. That is, until half a year ago, when, out of the blue, in support for the sequel's launch, Gearbox actually went back and added not a minor DLC, a full campaign to Borderlands 2 for people to play. They did that. Is ArenaNet so incapable? Well, maybe they are. Maybe it's a matter of economy. Maybe it's a matter of the archaic code base and people not knowing how to work with it and not wanting to learn. Maybe it's just not being able to convince the higher-ups. If it is one of those arguments, or all three, there really isn't much we can do except appreciate the minor works of any developers that drop small changes in anyway. I'll be forever appreciative of the anniversary updates and the graphics work in 2018, and keenly hoping for more. Thanks for watching.